And that now brings us to the last, well, almost the last. I'm going to throw in an extra one this year. Thing 6 that you need to know about China in the modern world, and that is that China has / will resume its rightful place as a major leader of Asia and a major world power. Now, I put in has / will resume its rightful place. What do I mean by that? Well, because a lot of folks are still arguing about it. Is China a fully developed nation? Is it as rich as it claims? Is it in the big boy country category? Let me let you in on my personal opinion. I say yes. I believe China is already a full-fledged, fully developed country, and it is a world power, really on par with the United States. In fact, for the rest of our lives, there's really only going to be 2 major world powers, and that is the United States and China. There have been propositions to have a G2 club instead of a G7 or a G8, just a G2, just the United States and China. China actually kind of scoffed at that. But it brings home the point, I think, that yes, how can you even debate about whether China is a fully developed, fully rich place or not, given that they're going to be the largest economy on planet Earth soon, if they're not already? They have the highest levels of technology, highest levels of materialism that are now exceeding the United States, internal and domestic and foreign financial capital that's going gangbusters everywhere, and they're doing a host of other things that only fully developed super rich countries do. What things? Well, I'll get to that in a second, but just let me give you the counter argument. There are those that still would say, but wait a minute though. Boyer, you can't say that they're a fully developed state because they still have millions and maybe hundreds of millions of people below the poverty line. Hey, point taken, man. I get that. But China's also done this other thing, namely it has pulled more people above the poverty line in the last few decades than any other country at any time in human history. They have raised so many people up since the late 1970s, like hundreds of millions of people who were below the poverty line are now lower middle class or upper middle class. And in fact, I always look at the middle class to detect how a state is doing. And to me, getting back to my personal opinion, I say China has the largest middle class on planet Earth. So it's kind of hard to argue that they're not a fully developed state already. And to me, it's a joke to argue that China is not already a major world power on par with the United States. Now, they have a little bit a ways to go to catch up militarily with the United States, but they're working on that, and they're working on that quickly. But let me point out a few things besides the financial stuff that reinforces this concept that China's back, baby, and it is a major world power. They've been doing things other than getting super rich, which only fully developed states do. Namely, we left off our timeline talking about the territories reverting back to China in 1999, getting favorable trade nation status with the U.S., joining the WTO, and their economies sizzling in the 1990s, and it continues to sizzle in the 2000s. But that's not all. In 2003, China did its first man in space walk. What? Yeah, China has a space program. You know, you've heard of the one in the United States. It's called NASA. And the United States is the only country that's put a man on the moon so far. But the thing about China's space program, I want you to understand, is they didn't just borrow a rocket from Russia or the United States. They just borrow some technology and shoot a Chinese person into space and have them do a spacewalk. No. They've been investing in their space program for decades, and this is the culmination of their own homegrown program, using Chinese technology and Chinese parts, building Chinese rockets and Chinese space vehicles. This was a totally Chinese venture. And again, think about it. There's not that many states on planet Earth forever who have done something like, on their own, put a human walking around in space. The list gets really small. And when you start talking about even putting a man on the moon or human on the moon or anything else beyond just the close outer orbit, really now it's just the United States, Russia, and China. This is a pretty exclusive club. What's so important about this? Is it so important that the Chinese had a human walk in space? Yes, I think it is, because it denotes that this is a society, this is a country, this is a state that not only has the excess capital to pull this off, and you have to be not just rich, you have to have levels of technology that are in place, you have to have a drive to want to do this. You know what? Saudi Arabia's rich. Equatorial Guinea is rich. They ain't putting humans in space. They're paper rich in a bank. They don't have the technology capital and the human capital and the drive to do something like this. Big boy, fully developed countries do, and China is now in that club. So that's what's so important about the Chinese putting a man in space in 2003. But that ain't the only thing that's been going on. In 2008, and now we're getting into very modern history that some of you probably remember. In 2008, China hosted the Olympics. And they won them. What? Yeah, again, things that only countries that have a drive to do it and have the capital to pull it off host the Olympics. Because it takes hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of internal investment in order to get ready for the Olympic Games. China pulled it off in 2008 in stunning array of awesomeness. Basically, they rebuilt half of Beijing. Who knows how many billions of dollars they spent to make it a flawless presentation in 2008, and it was. And on top of it being a flawless presentation of the Olympics, the Chinese won. They won more gold medals than any other country. Boom, boom, boom. You're starting to see these ducks get lined up in a row here of, this is a serious country, all right? It isn't just that they're rich. Oh, they got a bunch of money because they sell a bunch of crap that's filling up the Walmart store shelves in America. That's way too simplistic of an approach. This is a country that is back in action, that sees itself with a certain matter of national pride, that has the capital, the resources, and the willpower to do these big things and do them very, very well. The Olympics, it's just a game thing that happens once every 4 years. But to me, it really tips you off of how a country's doing is how well they pull them off. And then if you win them too, it's kind of a big deal. Some analysts would argue, or not argue, point out that the 2008 Olympics for many is China's coming out party, meaning that this is when they were presenting their finest face to the world and saying, we are here, we are a world power, we're pulling this off, and we won this sucker. We are now in the driver's seat of Asia, and we are on par as a world power, on par with the United States. I think that's a logical assessment. It really is. We're here, and we're back in 2008. Does that make sense? That's not the only thing that happened in 2008, though. Dig this. In 2008, just after the Olympics, the Chinese did a spacewalk. So in 2003, they put a human into space, okay, and floated around in orbit, then brought him back. In 2008 is when they actually did a Chinese spacewalk where they put a Chinese person in space and they went outside of the spaceship and moved around and did stuff and then got back into the spaceship. Again, you're starting to narrow the field greatly of countries that have pulled that off. It's really kind of just 3 countries that have ever done it. This was a huge celebration in China because, again, it comes on the heels of a very successful Olympics that the Chinese won, and then they just put a man in space and they did a spacewalk. That's not the only thing that happened in 2008. In the same year is when the brick gets laid. Now we call them the BRICS. The B-R-I-C. You remember that acronym from a lecture many moons ago. Brazil, Russia, India, and C for China. Now we're adding S for South Africa. That's questionable. But anyway, the BRICS countries get together. And these are, hopefully you know this by now, the BRIC countries are these emerging economy. I'm not even sure what that means anymore either. Emerging markets that are non-Western. They are not in Team West. They're not part of the Team West super rich countries on planet Earth. They're their own club that is getting super rich. And that at the time that they were forming up in 2008, they were some of the fastest growing economies on planet Earth, growing way faster than the average rich Western country was. And they kept up those growth rates for a pretty good clip. Now here in 2016, it's on again, off again with the BRICS, but it's still kind of a big deal that you have China as one of the anchors of a non-Western institution, a non-Western group of countries that are getting rich and growing and working together on coordinated economic policy. But that's not the only thing that's going on. So 2008 is a really super big year for China. It is now fully officially on the world stage. Hey, we're here, we're a world power. And national pride is super swelling. And I'm going to take just 30 seconds to kind of razz you up a little bit to get you into the Chinese mindset. still in play here in 2016. That in 2008, when all of these things are happening, it's hard to explain this to you Americans or you Saudis or you South Africans, wherever you're from. But in 2008, it's kind of the culmination of decades of hard work for 1 billion plus Chinese people after a couple hundred years of being repressed and humiliated. And 2008 is kind of the capstone of this. It's like, yes, we have done it. Our society is one of the richest, greatest on planet Earth again after a couple hundred years. Now remember, China stood up in 1949, but they were standing up basically still on their knees because the economy and the culture and everything was so shaken and rattled and troubled. It took 50 to 60 years to get all the way back up to this stage in 2008 of like, wow, everybody's looking around saying, our country's awesome. Our freaking country is awesome. We are the envy of the world. We just won the Olympics. We're putting humans in space. We can do anything. It's hard to explain it to folks from countries who are not like this. America's great, by the way. Most people love America. But you have to go back in time to get this nationalistic pride that I'm trying to explain to you. And that would be perhaps just after World War II. In fact, that's it right there. Just after World War II, none of us were alive for that, but after World War II, America, which had industrialized, had gotten rich, even before World War II, the whole from 1900 to 1950, the United States is industrializing and getting richer and becoming a world power and starting to become a master in the world. In World War I and World War II, the United States sent out troops and helped win those wars. World War II particularly, it was won pretty much by the United States in the Pacific realm and would not have been won so easily without the United States' help in Europe. So the U.S. is like, yeah, and then everybody comes back from war and after World War II, and our economy is awesome. And so we're the winner of a couple of world wars. Our economy's awesome. Everybody comes home and is excited, and they go back to work in the factories and in the fields, and they all have houses, and the economy's roaring, and people are buying stuff, and yeah, we are awesome. And we win the Olympics all the time anyway, and so, yeah, America's great. That's exactly what's happening in China right now, where the average Chinese person's like, yeah, America, yeah, they're in recession and they're all whiny and they're involved in multiple foreign wars and they're a divided society. We ain't in China. We feel great about our country and we're supporting our government and all these great things are happening and every generation after generation is getting richer than the one before it. Yeah, the dragon is back. Does that make sense? Hold on, let me recover from my self-induced cardiac arrest right there. Does that give you a sense of what's going on with when I say the national pride in China is really untouchable compared to any other place on planet Earth right this second. They're proud of their government, they're proud of their country, they're proud of themselves, and they're getting richer and happier. There are problems. We'll get to that in the conclusion. But the other thing that I referred to earlier is that millions and millions of people have been pulled from poverty in China in this intervening period from 1949 up to the present. The poverty rates in China, I want to say off the top of my head, have dropped from, say, 85% poverty to 15% in the course of, say, from 1980 up to 2008. There used to be a lot more people. Remember, just after World War II, just after the Chinese Civil War, I mean, this is an agrarian-based society that's been destroyed for a couple hundred years. There ain't a lot going on. And so most people are what we'd call poor, way below the poverty line. And in the course of the intervening decades, literally hundreds of millions of people go from nothing to having a job and a house and running water and electricity. It is easily the biggest movement of people economically from low to up in human history. And it's something for China to be really, really proud of. And so in today's China, yeah, there's still poverty. Hell, guess what? There's poverty in the United States too. There's poverty in the Netherlands. There's poverty in Great Britain. You can't eliminate poverty, but China is now at the point that proportionally their poverty, their richness and their poverty rates are about the same as the rich countries. So I'm sure they'll work on it, just like rich countries do. But they're there. Does that make sense? And in today's China, they're not just focusing on everybody having a job and 40 acres and a mule and and getting a decent wage, there is now so much wealth in China that you've had a middle class form, a big one, but you've also had a super elite class form. And now there are more millionaires and more billionaires in China than in any other country on planet Earth. And those numbers keep going up too. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. It's wealth disparity. I'm not judging it. I'm just saying it is. There's so much wealth in China now that you have a super elite upper class that's been formed along with the upper middle class and the middle class and the petit bourgeois lower middle class. And what's happening now, because Chinese exports have slowed down, because as people get richer in China, they demand higher wages. It's just the way it happens all over planet Earth. You could pay people a nickel an hour 50 years ago in China, and they'd be happy to do the work. But now everybody's getting a little bit richer, and they're not going to work for a nickel an hour. So labor rates have risen, which means it's not as cheap to make stuff in China anymore. And some jobs have migrated out to other countries that have cheaper labor. But the Chinese government has worked this in intentionally as a long-term economic program where they said, yeah, we know this is going to happen, but we now want to culminate local entrepreneurs for the last couple of decades to make Chinese-made stuff like watches and cars and mopeds and refrigerators and wine and luxury goods. I keep coming back to wine because the Chinese know that wine is a very, what we call, conspicuous consumption deal, meaning you want to have your Rolex showing or your mink coat, or really rich refined people, they drink wine. So China doesn't want Chinese people all buying European wine or American wine. They're making their own wine, and China will be the world's largest wine producer in the next 10 to 20 years, and they will be the world's largest wine consumer in the next 10 to 20 years, probably less than 10. So conspicuous consumption, uber materialism, these are all things that China had done in the past, but they looked to the West and said, hey, yeah, that's what the West does too. And we are as fully developed as them, and we want to behave like them, and we want to have that certain lifestyle like they have. And it is happening. So you couple all of this surging domestic economy is what we call it now, when you're producing Chinese goods for Chinese people, not just for export. China still makes serious bank exporting manufactured goods, and now it's making serious bank producing domestic goods for a domestic audience. And you couple all this stuff together with the national pride, and that China's becoming more powerful regionally. So all the countries around Asia, including even the Pacific Rim, countries like Chile or Australia and New Zealand, everybody knows that, hey, to do business in the modern world, you have to deal with China. Nobody was doing that 50 years ago. It didn't exist. Even 30 years ago, you wouldn't care that much if your country traded with China. Now it's an absolute must. If you don't have a trade relationship with China, you ain't going nowhere. Your economy's going to be hobbled. So everybody's, I'm not going to say having to kiss China's ass, but things have been reconfigured here in the 21st century to understand that China is as big and as important as the United States is economically and financially. So you're going to have to do business with them, and you want to do business with them because they've got a market of 1.5 billion people who might want your stuff. Now, that financial, economic power eventually always translates to political power too. So other things that are going in China's favor right now are as they exert their power a little bit outwards financially, you know what? The Taiwan issue is going away a little bit, as I suggested to you a couple lectures ago. The Chinese also are the greatest holder of U.S. debt. So there's some people who still think that China is going to declare war on the United States, or there's going to be some big fracas between the U.S. and China. I think it's laughable because the two biggest economies on planet Earth are now so interwoven with stuff they buy from each other and debt that they own from each other. China's the largest single holder of U.S. debt, and that's a big debt. So for China to bomb the United States, they might as well bomb their own banks because the debt that they hold will become worthless. It's kind of a big deal that financial power does exert out into kind of raw political power. So China on the world stage is, to me, it's not a myth, it's not up for debate. Yes, they're here. They're behaving and doing things that the biggest, richest world powers have done over the centuries and do here even in today's world. From holding debt that they can use then for political purposes in order to influence others to, say, not recognize Taiwan or to have a better trade policy with the United States, to having a space program where they're putting Chinese people out into orbit. And I want to go ahead and throw this in too, because I'm a huge huge, passionate guy about space stuff. I still think it's the future. And that is that China has designs to put a Chinese person on the moon. This has been in the cards for a couple decades. They've been talking about it. China says it will launch a manned flight into space and a mission to the moon by 2020. I believe they're ahead of that target. So it could be within the next 4 or 5 years you see the next humans land on the moon, and those humans will be Chinese humans. This puts China then in a class of 2 countries that have ever pulled that off, and that would be them and the United States. You're starting to get the sensation of what I'm talking about here with national pride and China being a big boy country. But I don't want to exaggerate the space program too much. They've been making leaps and bounds in that direction, and it's fascinating to watch. I actually think it's going to initiate a space race, a good old-fashioned space race, which the United States and the Soviet Union had back during the Cold War. And then once the United States got to the moon, everybody's like, yay, we won, and nobody paid attention anymore. I think the Chinese motivation and drive to get to the moon and possibly to Mars is what is going to create that competition again that the United States and other entities will get involved in. So Space Race 2 could be on the way. But let's get back to Earth. Let me get it back to Earth to finish up this section of China as back on the world stage as a major world power. What you've had in the last couple decades, well, let's call it a decade and a half, since the super hot economic growth of the 90s raised China's profile economically on planet Earth and continued into the 2000s, is that the former president and premier of China, and that was Hu Jintao, was the former president, and Wen Jiabao was the former premier. These were 2 guys who were in power from 2002 to 2012. And the way that presidents and premiers are elected in China is that the Chinese Communist Party has a party about every 5 years. And in this party, they put out their next 5 to 10 to 20 year economic and military and political plan. And they have a kind of round table vote and say, okay, who are we going to put in as the president and leader of the Communist Party for the next 5 to 10 years? So there's no elections, okay? The people don't vote on this. It's a Communist Party vote. And these 2 guys, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, they did fabulous during their 10-year run in the top slots of Chinese power. They oversaw all of this transition I'm talking about, this building of national pride, this building of their national economy, both foreign and domestic. And they were also very much internationalists. They were what I call men about town, because they, in their 10 years, visited virtually every country on planet Earth, some of them multiple times. And they were going around making trade deals and sweet economic pacts and maybe talking politics and maybe talking military doctrine, but they did it with everybody. I don't mean to make fun of the United States, but who was in power for most of the same time period, 2002 to 2012? Well, from 2000 to 2010, it was the Bush administration, which with Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney got involved in multiple wars around planet Earth. That's what they did. And at the same time, the Chinese weren't getting involved in any wars. They were around brokering deals. Brokering deals to not just introduce Chinese foreign policy to other countries, but really to cement strong ties of friendship and ties of economic cooperation. That was their full-time job for a decade, and they did it very well. They did it again to make nicey nice with China and all the other countries they visited, to try to get sweet trade deals. They also did it with an eye towards resource acquisition. And that is that China, as the world's second largest economy, soon to be first, it's a big engine of manufacturing. And they need stuff. They need energy. China only has coal. It doesn't have a whole lot of oil or anything else. They need energy. They need stuff like steel and aluminum and tungsten. They need rubber. They have to import all these raw materials in order to be the manufacturing giant that they have been. And so they have focused on resource acquisition for that decade, going and making trade deals with everyone around planet Earth to get the stuff that they want, to make sure they were running copper mines in Zambia and had rubber tree plantations in Brazil and buying soy products from Brazil to help feed their huge 1.5 billion population. So all of this culminates together in that China spent a solid decade making everybody kind of like China and want to trade with China and cementing these long-term contractual deals with China, while the United States and Western European countries were busy doing other things, namely war. I'm not making fun of the United States, by the way. I just want you to keep the timeline in play here. What these major powers are doing from 2000 to 2010. China had a very clear goal of what it was doing, and it did it, and it did it really well. But they weren't satisfied with simply just buying stuff, buying raw materials and turning them into finished manufactured goods, which are worth a lot more. China is now becoming so rich by 2005, 2006, 2008, 2010. They're so rich, they have a lot of money in the bank. That's why they started buying up U.S. foreign debt, by the way. But they wanted to start then exerting their power outwards, financially and economically, a little bit more, with a little more clout than simply just buying stuff from other countries. 2008 is another red letter year, I think, for China, because it's in that year that China joins the InterAmerican Development Bank as one of the partners of the bank. What? China was part of an Inter-American bank? Yes. Much to the chagrin of the United States, China came in and said, hey, look, you guys don't have as much money as we do sitting in the bank. We'll donate $350 million to the Inter-American Bank. And this is a bank within the Americas, mostly run by the United States, that lends money to different countries in the Americas for projects. Kind of like a mini World Bank, where you say, hey, you guys want to build a hydroelectric dam in Ecuador? We can lend you money for that. Or you want to build a road system across Brazil? We can lend you money for that. And it was mostly an American thing run by mostly the United States until China got in on the board and said, hey, we have capital. We want to invest in this. It invests in finance development projects across Latin America and the Caribbean. And China was the first outside of the Americas entity to join this bank. Joining the bank, by the way, means you have some power and control over what happens with the funds of the bank, meaning you have a vote. You have a voice in a bank in America's backyard. And that's kind of the start of the next phase, I want to say, of exertion of Chinese financial power. And it's taken up in haste by the next president of China, and that is Xi Jinping. Please know President Xi Jinping of China. He took over in 2012. And China is already now super rich. It's hard to argue that they're not a world power by 2012. But Xi says, well, you guys focused on resource acquisition and doing trade deals across the planet. I'm now going to focus on extending China's power financially in all spectrums. So that Inter-American Bank joining was just the start of it. In July 2014, China took the lead in bringing together the major emerging economies that we talked about, the BRICS, the BRICS. And they are on the it's Chinese idea to form a new development bank, or NDB, and China put up $50 billion into this bank, and this bank is run by the BRICS in order to fund projects and other initiatives in the emerging markets themselves, but also countries that they like. Now, now we're starting to talk finance, and maybe I'm losing some of you, and you're like, this is boring, I don't care. Dude, I'm telling you it's important. So China, under China's leadership, the BRICS countries have basically formed an alternative to the World Bank and an alternative to the IMF. Who runs the World Bank and the IMF, do you think? If you said Team West, you win. So what we have here is now in 2013, 2014, and into 2015, China making the very concrete and open steps to say we are going to help build alternative funding institutions to the World Bank and the IMF, because those two are totally controlled by Team West, mostly by the United States and its tight allies. So if you want to borrow money from them, you have to do what they want you to do. We're going to start our own bank, and we're going to lend to folks in other places with maybe different focuses and different initiatives and a different set of rules that will help you see our frame of thinking, and maybe you'll do things that we want you to do instead of always having to suck up to Team West. You start to see how important this finance stuff is, but that's not the only one. The same year, they gave $2 billion to something called the SouthSouth Cooperation Group. And this is a group set up, I think even through the United Nations maybe, but it's an exchange of resources, technology, and knowledge between the developing countries of the southern hemisphere. The global south, we call it. Pretty much all the poorer or lesser developed countries south of the equator. and it's a grouping set up to try to help them trade with each other more, do stuff with each other more, exchange technologies more, and rise up a little bit more. And China has taken the lead in this South-South Cooperation group as well, saying, yes, we want to help this group pony up and do better, and we'll put in $2 billion more. That's just almost a goodwill type of thing. Here's some money, go get better. China's looking out for you. They, in the same year, or maybe this is closer to now, 2015, these things all get proposed in the last few years, and some of them get inked, and some of them they're still working on. But everything I'm talking about has been in the last few years, including this last one I want you to definitely know, the Silk Road Fund. And this is definitely a 100% Chinese deal. I'm sorry, there's two more. This is another really important one. The Silk Road Fund, China threw down $40 billion, and it's a Chinese state-owned investment fund run by the Chinese government to foster increased investments in countries along the old Silk Road. They're putting it right out there for you, man. Here's what we want. We are back, and we're going to reestablish not just that we're rich in our borders, we're going to reestablish the old ways, going back 2,000 years. We're going to help countries that used to be on the old Silk Road, going across on land, and we're going to help invest in projects and roads and highways and train systems and gas pipelines all the way down to help link all of us up, link you all up to Mother China here, to the dragon. You see how potent this stuff is? And in fact, they call it the One Belt, One Road Economic Development Initiative. And the belt, it's a little confusing. The belt, it runs into Central Asia and all the way into Europe. And the belt component is the old Silk Road, the old Silk Route, okay, land route. And they want to link up all those countries again. And the road is actually the Maritime route. There was a Maritime Silk Road as well, out of those southern Chinese ports, throughout Southeast Asia, over to the Indian Ocean, and all the way over to Africa. And so, it's just confusing, the road is actually on the water. So the road part is a maritime rim link from China, Southeast Asia, Pakistan, all the way to the Middle East, and the east coast of Africa. And they want to facilitate helping all of those places I just mentioned, especially Pakistan. Start in your head. Pakistan, Pakistan, Pakistan. China saying, we'll help all of the old Silk Road on the ocean. We want to help all you countries too. So we have this $40 billion fund set up to help you invest in your port infrastructure. Yeah. And even railroads and roads leading to your port structures, so that we can all move stuff in and out of our countries and along the Maritime Silk Road better as well. Aren't we just being the nicest people ever here in the Chinese government? Well, maybe, but they're certainly making all of these countries way more economically dependent on China. All of these investments, this whole Silk Road Fund is basically setting up China as the center of the Asian universe, which it historically was. And let me end with this. This is the capstone of it. In 2015, and again, I think this was proposed in 2013, but it's coming to fruition in 2015, they weren't satisfied with the BRICS Bank or being a part of, say, the InterAmerican Bank. And I think even China now is one of these sitting members of the IMF even. So they've broken into the Western institutions as well. However, in 2015, now they're doing something called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. I haven't even done a podcast on this one yet. It's so new. And basically, this is a 100% alternative to the IMF and the World Bank smashed into one. So they're saying, yes, IMF does that and the World Bank does that. We're going to do all that together here, and we're going to throw down, I don't know, $100 billion, $150 billion in the bank, us personally, and we're inviting all the other countries of the world, of Asia for sure, but of the world, to come on in and invest in this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Okay. How did the world receive that? Well, the United States was none too happy about it because, again, every one of these investment banks I'm talking about further sidelines America and Team West's role as the major financiers of planet Earth. And when you run the banks, you have a lot of political clout. And so China has basically not replaced them, but they're giving this big non-Western alternative to, yeah, you can go over to the Team West if you want, but you can also bank here. So the United States has been none too happy about this AIIB, and they've been even more infuriated because China said, hey, it's not limited to Asian countries. Everybody could invest. We want all of the world to invest in this bank. By invest, I mean become a part of the board, throw in money, and be part of the bank's board, okay? And guess who else joined? Multiple G7 countries joined, including Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom, who all rushed, fell over themselves to throw down money and be founding members of the AIIB. America was very unhappy about that. They went even to the United Kingdom going, what? WTF? What are you talking about? But UK, you're our boy. You can't do this AIIB. And the UK was like, okay, but we're going to. So this is I won't say a coup, but indicative of China's real world power role here. That's what I'm stressing. Please don't take the last half-hour lecture as some sort of warning that China's going to take over the world. No, nonsense. I'm trying to suggest that China is a world power behaving the way that world powers do and behaving the way it has in the past as a world power. I could probably go on and on and on, because you know I always can, but I will say that China continues this goodwill tour of the world, trying to gain allies and get people to think more in a Chinese way than a simply Team West way. And in December of 2015, heck, that's just last month, China promised to invest $60 billion in African development all across Africa, helping build roads and dams and energy facilities and into schools. China, for all of the time I've been talking about for the last couple decades, has gone into places like Africa, like South America, like Central Asia, and said, hey, if you have a sweet trade deal with us, we'll build a soccer stadium for you, or we'll build a highway for you, or we'll do this, or we'll lend you money. No strings attached. No political strings attached. We'll lend you $1 billion. You can do whatever you want to with as long as we get our money back. That's not the way that the United States works. So China has very intentionally been this alternative to the Team West approach to lending money, and it's been working for them. So $60 billion over the next 3 years they're going to invest into Africa, again, to cement their role as a world power and a world power player outside of their borders. And this now does finish up this section and forces me to add another section which I've never done before. And that is China is also extending its power in other ways, not just financially. China now has an aircraft carrier. Yeah, just from a couple years ago. I believe they're working on a second one. China is now claiming pieces of property that are not on the Chinese mainland. So what we have here is international reach financially has been growing solid for 20 years, and that is now translating into international reach politically and perhaps militarily starting to be pushed out from the mainland to other parts of the planet. Remember, the awesome thing about aircraft carriers is that they project your power anywhere in the world, not just in your country. China has one, they're going to have two. Maybe we better deal with this in the next section, shall we?